Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Democracies in America, Key Words for the 19th Century and Today. Edited by Gregory Laski and D. Berton Emerson. Narrated by Lisa Larsen, James Babson, Mia Ellis, Vyvy Nguyen, Amir Abdullah, and Kyla García. These abstract terms, which abound in democratic languages, and which are used on every occasion without attaching them to any particular fact, enlarge and obscure the thoughts they are intended to convey. They render the mode of speech more succinct, and the idea contained in it less clear. But with regard to language, democratic nations prefer obscurity to labor. I do not know, indeed, whether this loose style has not some secret charm for those who speak and write among these nations. As the men who live there are frequently left to the efforts of their individual powers of mind, they are almost always a prey to doubt, and as their situation in life is forever changing, they are never held fast to any of their opinions by the immobility of their fortunes. Men living in democratic countries, then, are apt to entertain unsettled ideas. Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, 1840. Tell us how things are today, thus allowing the possibility that they might be different tomorrow. This articulation, this noticing and describing, does not necessarily constitute civic participation, but it does at the very least mean throwing one's hat in the ring. It means anteing into the game of our democracy. Chiara Allegria Jures, A World of Cousins, in Education and Equality, 2016. Forward. Educators are often told, increasingly through legislative mandate, to teach just the facts. But in a country where various groups seem to hold to their own set of facts, what are the shared facts to be taught about democracy? This is the question with which Democracies in America wrestles. I was trained in the law, a discipline people seek in order to answer the question, is this legal? Frighteningly unsatisfying as it may be, the best answer is most often, it depends. After listening to this book, a reader might also answer whether the United States is a democracy with it depends. I see in this volume a resource for those who don't want simple answers. Indeed, uncomfortable answers are this book's currency, as it explores the vocabulary of democracy, using the period between 1789 and 1914 as an anchor to build this understanding. The power of the essays in Democracies in America lies in the ways the contributors highlight the many tensions inherent in constitutional democracy, exposing the fragility of pillars we hold dear and take as firm. That is a lesson that would serve us well to heed. Why ask a practitioner in the K-12 education space to write the foreword for this book? I imagine the question the editors would want answered is how these meditations about democracy can hope to shape how young people would understand democracy. Are we a republic or a democracy? We ask this specific question as part of the Educating for American Democracy, EAD, initiative, for which I served as chair of the steering committee. EAD brought together more than 300 teachers, scholars, students, and leaders from the private and public sectors, representing viewpoint, professional, and demographic diversity, to produce the roadmap to Educating for American Democracy for K-12 history and civics excellence. We ultimately chose the term constitutional democracy to resolve the tensions between a populist and an elitist representative form of governance. To educators, our choice of this particular phrase will matter less than the replicable process of inquiry and debate that led us to that choice. EAD outlines a vision of the future of history and civic education in the United States. The EAD roadmap is made up of 7 themes, each supported by U.S. history and civics questions. The questions parallel the process that Democracies in America employs, deep explorations of vocabulary and concepts, refusing to accept a surface-level understanding of who we the people are, for example. As I read the essays in Democracies in America, I kept in mind the challenge for educators embodied in EAD Design Challenge 1. How can we help students understand the full context for their roles as civic participants without creating paralysis or a sense of the insignificance of their own agency in relation to the magnitude of our society, the globe, and shared challenges? The energy and sense of possibility that animates young people is critical to democracy. We erode innocence and agency at our own peril. Cynicism is the enemy of learning. So what then? Is this just an intellectual exercise? How should educators engage in democracy education? To that complex question, I only offer that the answers to the questions in the roadmap and those raised in Democracies in America reflect the values of the community in which they are taught. Whether considering matters of law or the vocabulary of democracy, the variances in meaning and evolution in understanding are shaped through our individual and collective lived experiences. Since teaching about democracy involves teaching a set of values, it is an inherently political act, whether or not educators share their personal values explicitly. As educators consider their role in the formation of citizens, they should view Democracies in America from the perspective of the contributions of individuals and groups of people not as heroes, but as shapers of ideas and institutions, as dissenters and movement leaders who have shaped the world today and provided guidance about how to contribute to a more perfect union. In knowing more about the historical and current vocabulary of democracy, listeners will find inspiration to shape their own values and stimulate their actions in concert with others in continuing to shape democracies in America. Louise Dubé.
Introduction. Democracies in America, A User's Guide. D. Berton Emerson and Gregory Laski. Ask your neighbor, classmate, or colleague their thoughts about democracy in America, and you will undoubtedly get many different responses. Some may assume it our national condition, a presence as constant as the air we breathe. The more skeptical might consider it a concept once established, yet now under threat and increasingly beyond recovery. Others may read it more cynically, suspicious that democracy has always been and will continue to be compromised by the interests of an empowered few. Still others may refuse the word altogether, holding that oligarchy better describes the national political structure, or identifying in different terms, justice, freedom, a more compelling vision. Finding that democracy induces anxiety. Too many may even prefer to ignore it completely. In a contemporary United States, marked by constituencies across the political spectrum, who comfortably accept that all is well, or, more likely, believe that their voices have gone unheard and their interests unheeded, democracy gets wielded in so many divergent directions as to be rendered nearly incoherent. Perhaps a recent commentator put it best: at present, we are bewildered by democracy. A generation ago, after 2 world wars and an ideological battle between East and West, liberal democracy purportedly enjoyed a global triumph over totalitarian communism. In the 21st century, by contrast, this political system occupies a decidedly more precarious position. Increasing polarization, technological innovation, demographic change, and economic inequality, all decades in the making, are testing the limits of the constitutional structures imagined and established in the 18th and 19th centuries. Can democracy work? How democracy ends, how democracies die, nervous states, democracy and the decline of reason, and the people versus democracy are just a few examples of recently published books bearing moribund meditations. Recent surveys back up such arguments. One oft-cited and potentially alarming appraisal has revealed that in the United States, the so-called millennial generation holds little faith in democracy. Only about 30% of those born after 1980 deem it essential to live in a country that is governed democratically. Interpreting such a response is not easy, and understanding precisely what governed democratically might have meant to the respondents is not completely clear. The survey included as potential characteristics of democracy, which respondents could affirm or reject: people choose their leaders in free elections, and the state makes people's incomes equal. In other words, by asking just what political equality has to do with economic equality, the survey raised a dilemma that has dogged democratic devotees and detractors for millennia. Put differently, if the results are bewildering, so too are the values implicit in the questions. Such a state of affairs is not entirely new. When the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville published the second volume of Democracy in America in 1840, roughly 50 years after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, he sought to define the characteristics of an emerging order, even as he complained about the difficulties inherent in that endeavor. A deplorable consequence of democracy, Tocqueville wrote, was its effect on language itself. Just as democracy disrupts social hierarchies and deracinates ancestral origins in the name of individualism, this system also unsettles the very means people use to articulate their ideas and express their commitments. Terms travel across social classes, with vulgar words showing up in refined contexts. Meanings get twisted, redefined, and reappropriated, and abstract terms seem to become completely untethered to any particular fact. In that last condition, however, Tocqueville saw both possibility and peril. Democratic nations are passionately addicted to generic terms and abstract expressions, he explained, because these modes of speech enlarge thought and assist the operations of the mind by enabling it to include many objects in a small compass. And yet, although it promotes vision and creation, this linguistic imprecision also makes expressions quicker, but conceptions less clear. In matters of language, democracies prefer obscurity to labor. As an example, Tocqueville mentions equality, one of his, and this book's, key words. But he might as well have included the very term in the title of his famous study. For no matter what else it is and means, democracy is one of those unsettled ideas. Authors and activists, politicians and ordinary people, before and after Tocqueville, have mined this expansiveness to different ends. This volume does not promise to narrow the range of meanings. Indeed, in making plural Tocqueville's title, Democracies in America, asserts that democracy, as an unsettled idea, full of contradictions and perhaps irresolvable dilemmas, is not a bad thing. To the contrary, that condition of unsettlement is precisely what facilitates debate and discussion, contestation and conflict, hopeful revision, and powerful protest. In short, the very lifeblood of democratic philosophy and practice. But this book does maintain, in fact, it unambiguously affirms, that doing this hard work requires a deliberate meditation on what democracy means and might mean. As the political theorist and volume contributor Danielle Allen has argued, a shared vocabulary should bind us all as Americans. What words do we need to talk about the problems and promise of shared life in America? And what is the grammar and syntax required to turn that vocabulary into a living, breathing language? In short, how can we talk about democracy as it exists today? Holding that a shared conversation about democracy is not only possible, but urgently necessary, this book tackles these questions head-on and seeks to provide resources for responding. Acknowledging that the language of democracy is always provisional, always in need of assessment, revision, and reinvigoration, this volume offers a series of short, provocative meditations on 25 terms that can enrich the lexicon we employ to understand democracy in theory and practice. Penned by a group of intellectuals from various fields of study and written for a wide audience, the entries explore terms both commonplace, citizenship and representation, and surprising, disgust and sham. Historically, the essays focus on a common period, roughly the decades preceding and following the publication of Tocqueville's study, what we call the long 19th century. This is an era that spans the vitality of the revolutionary epoch, the contentious lead-up to the Civil War, the progress and regress of post-war Reconstruction, and the early reforms of the Progressive period. In connecting this foundational past to our present, Democracies in America invites listeners to reflect on the meaning of this and related key words to create a usable language of democracy that remains relevant across time. We maintain that a language that addresses the enduring dilemmas of democracy is the place to turn to and return to as a starting point for thinking about the many challenges that confront democratic citizens today. Ultimately, this book aspires to cultivate, for students and teachers in classrooms, as well as those in libraries and cafés, a language to discuss, define, and refine the possibilities and problems of democracy in America. When is the long 19th century, and why focus on that period? Democracy does not simply have a history. Democracy is a history, Pierre Rosenvalen has argued, and therefore the study of this term must be situated in a permanent dialogue between past and present. This volume has chosen a particular past for this dialogue. U.S. history happening between 1789, when the founding generation translated an imagined political system into a structural reality, and 1914, the dawn of the Progressive Era and the First World War. Other periods might have served as a point of reference to orient our inquiry. The 20th century, with its transformative fights for inclusion based on race and gender, and international engagements with multiple wars supposedly fought to defend democracy, or the Revolutionary Era, prior to the consolidation of the Constitution and its manifold compromises. But these epochs are comparatively well known and enshrined in national historical consciousness via curricula and culture, and both periods, whether in the glories of the founding or in the rise to the position of global superpower, are fraught with presumptions of unquestioned triumph and the false reassurances of continuity and fulfillment. Less so with the long 19th century. Although celebrated in Tocqueville's famous study, democracy in 19th century America witnessed endless visions and revisions, conflicts and calamities, and was marked by compromises, successful and failed, breeding complications that have enduring relevance for our current moment. A brief smattering of instances illustrates this point. For example, in slavery, the Civil War, and especially Reconstruction, we find the sources and stories to understand abiding challenges such as systemic racism, mass incarceration, and income inequality, as well as acute crises such as the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, which sought to overthrow the results of the 2020 election and usurp the electoral will of the multiracial American people. Similarly, if women's suffrage today seems an indisputable democratic value, the contentious path to the 19th Amendment, which spanned the antebellum and postbellum eras, reveals a complicated truth that not all women identified the vote with democratic power, and historical curiosity that seems ironically relevant in the waves of the #MeToo movement. What's more, the long 19th century was the world of Walt Whitman and Frederick Douglass, who attempted, from their sometimes significantly divergent experiences, and both before and after internal war, to write into being a democratic polity through poetry and prose, much as artists and intellectuals do now, albeit via different yet no less cutting-edge media. This period likewise saw enlightening debates about material legal structures, such as the fraught relationship between states and the federal government, and the major revision to the meaning of race and citizenship enshrined in the 14th Amendment, all of which, in symbolic and structural ways, still resonate today. Indeed, the issues we confront in the 21st century United States, reactionary populism, racial division and discrimination, gender bias, income inequality, and the contours and boundaries of citizenship, to name just a few, are prefigured in the long 19th century. At times, as with the fight over the franchise or the quest of formerly enslaved black people to secure equal rights, the resonances between then and now are instructive. In other instances, the shift from the local to the national as a point of political identification and site of governance, for example, the differences inform us about potential ways to rework present institutional structures, such as congressional apportionment and the Electoral College. Foregrounding these continuities and ruptures, we adopt this era as a shared point of historical reference in order to both shed light on the understanding and practice of democracy formed in this critical period, and to explain how this epoch can help us take up discussions of democracy in the present. Why key words, and why these key words? Democracies in America seeks a language for this conversation by turning to the key word as a unit of meaning. In this, we take our cue from the British cultural historian Raymond Williams, who, in the middle of the 20th century, published Key Words, A Vocabulary of Culture and Society, now a classic work that has inspired a number of projects focused on unpacking, unlocking, accessing, or organizing knowledge, as the term key word suggests, including an expansion and update of his project entitled Key Words for Today, a 21st Century Vocabulary. Williams began his effort in the wake of the Second World War, when he returned to civilian life from military service, only to find himself in what seemed a different world where everything, including the language those around him spoke, had changed. This particular experience gave rise to a more general insight into a profound truth about culture and politics and the role of language therein. When we come to say, we just don't speak the same language, we mean that we have different immediate values or different kinds of valuation. In such a case, each group is speaking its native language, but its uses are significantly different, and especially when strong feelings or important ideas are in question. No single group is wrong by any linguistic criterion, though a temporarily dominant group may try to enforce its own uses as correct. Language is especially relevant to democracy. If you have ever heard or spoken the phrase, "But America is a republic, not a democracy," you get the gist. Williams was not talking explicitly about democracy, although that was one of his terms. Still, his point about the words he sought to define applies for our endeavor. The problems of its meanings seem to me inextricably bound up with the problems it was being used to discuss. The term itself is a case in point. Woven into its linguistic DNA, demos, people, and kratos, rule, are the immediate questions. Who are the people? And rule how? As the intellectual historian James Kloppenberg has pointed out, grappling with these terms is the launching point for any conversation about democracy, for they lead to the contested principles and premises of this political form. This is the hard work that Tocqueville noted was required for democratic deliberation, and that the Americans he surveyed at least were unwilling to take up. Importantly, however, the solution does not result from defining people and rule, or any other associated word or phrase, in an effort to fix their meaning. As Williams said of his key words, we also say of Democracies in America, this book is not a dictionary, but a vocabulary. Where the former seeks to fix proper meaning, always a limited and contingent task, a vocabulary seeks to clarify what we share with others, often imperfectly, when we wish to discuss many of the central processes of our common life. In this, the tension in how one person understands a term such as equality is not something to correct or resolve. Rather, the conflict is something to explore, for it will likely reveal a host of other problems, differences in experiences and how they inform our identities, and differences in power and access, to name only two. As thinkers such as Bonnie Honig and Astra Taylor have persuasively argued, democracy is rife with these sorts of dilemmas. Articulating and debating these dilemmas through key words reminds us that language is a crucial, if often neglected, component of civics education. With the selected terms, therefore, our book seeks to transform this vocabulary into a usable language. Language is composed not only of words, but also a grammar and syntax that connects words and enables the formations of sentences and, ultimately, claims. Accordingly, Democracies in America groups its key words within 4 parts, each of which has its own brief introduction that outlines a central problem and set of questions. The book begins with Part 1, Preamble, which focuses on preliminaries and 4 principles that are crucial for, and arguably haunt in some way, any attempt to define democracy, including the quandary of reducing America to the United States. Part 2, Institutions and Arrangements, features terms that we normally associate with the democratic procedures: representation, citizenship, constitution, and the town hall meeting, among others. Part 3, Feelings, Attitudes, and Interdependence, features terms that we identify with the more personal, non-procedural dimensions of democracy, such as disgust, comfort, and belief. Because the personal and the political can never finally be separated, the juxtaposition of parts 2 and 3 enacts yet another central dilemma: the constant collision of the individuated experience and collective life, and the way democracy appears to promise individual freedom and agency, but also necessarily checks and limits that agency for the common good. Finally, Part 4, Ambitions and Distortions, explores the tendency for democracy's dreams to quickly become nightmares and how we can respond when this happens. How to listen to this book and what to do with it. Just as you might start with the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, before moving on to the list of grievances or the Bill of Rights, you might begin by reviewing the 4 terms that compose Part 1 to Democracies in America. After that, you can listen to the parts in order or skip around. The short introduction to each part provides a sense of the central dilemma each grouping of words is engaging. The volume itself also ends by offering a meditation on possible paths for the future study of democracy. After perusing one entry or many, you might use these resources to reflect on what you have learned in this book and to revise it. Our part divisions should be understood as simply one way of organizing these terms, which themselves are far from exhaustive. We could not include every useful word for talking about democracy, but this truth represents a possibility rather than a limitation. As noted earlier, the language we use to talk about democracy is always evolving. Perhaps you will respond to the book by asking what would happen if you moved a word from one part to another to gain a different conceptual angle. If, say, the commons appeared in Part 1 rather than the final part. If you are listening or teaching this work in a classroom, you might consider the many intersections and divergences between terms and across parts, extend an entry to the present day, or revise a chapter using a different set of primary sources or a different disciplinary lens. Maybe you would compose an entry on race or gender, collating insights from the many terms in the book that take up those concepts, which pervaded culture and politics in the long 19th century. You could compile a second volume of key words and essays that prove just as crucial, if not more, to the lexicon of democracy, especially as the conditions we face change. What would an entry detailing the 19th century prehistory of Black Lives Matter or #MeToo look like? The final project of a course might be to revise a single essay or group of essays, or, even better, to rework the entire book in a class-composed collection. Such projects might even spill outside of the classroom and into the campus community, or beyond, via a conversation series that explores how to talk about American democracy and its shared values across various boundaries and borders. In this regard, finally, we hope that this volume contributes in a small way to the important work of 2 recent initiatives to strengthen American democracy. the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, sponsored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Educating for American Democracy Project,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?